I'm Inayaili, and I'm going to talk about CSS3 transforms, transitions, and animations. If you were at, I don't know if you were in Standards Next a few weeks ago. If you were, I'm sorry, because this is exactly the same presentation. So, how many of you have used CSS transforms, transitions, or animations before? Okay. And how many of you have used them in client work? Fewer. Okay. So this is gonna. I've divided this in two parts. In the first part is gonna be. We'll take a really brief look at how to use these tools, how to implement them. So it will be more like a refresh if you've already used them. And the second part, we'll stop and consider why we should use them or not. So what are these CSS3 transforms, transitions, and animations? Let's look at 2D transforms first. Is this working fine? Yeah, cool. So the W3C definition of 2D transforms says that CSS 2D transforms allows elements rendered by CSS to be transformed in two-dimensional space. And by transformed, it means that an element can be moved. The term used in the spec is translated, and it can be rotated or it can be scaled. Let's look at an example. So, if we want to move this flower div 600 pixels to the right when hovered over, first we'll define the div, and second we will use the transform function to apply the transformation when hovered over. In this case, we're using the translate x function to move this flower div in the x-axis. In these examples, I'm using the standard properties without the vendor-specific properties. We'll look at that later, just to make them, just to make it easier to follow. So there are a few transform functions available. These should be quite self-explanatory. So translate will move an object. You can move it on the x-axis or on the y-axis, and the same for the others. And if you were wondering, I don't think anyone really knows what matrix does. So we can combine different transforms in one. Here we are moving, scaling, rotating, and skewing the flower at the same time. And besides the actual transform property, you can also define other things like the point of origin of the transform by using the transform origin value. The default value for this is 50%, 50%, which is the exact center. And if you change the default value, you get a slightly different result. Also remember that when an element is transformed, that doesn't affect the content, the flow of the content around it. Besides 2D transforms, we have 3D transforms. The difference between 2D and 3D transforms is the addition of the z-axis, which is going to add perspective. So instead of scale, we get scale 3D, and we get the added scale z, and the same goes for the other functions. There are a couple more properties that you can control when you use 3D transforms. The perspective origin property lets you control the position of the viewer relative to the elements that are being transformed. So it can be lower or it can be higher, or it can be more to the left or more to the right. And the default value is 50%, 50%, like for the transform origin property that we just looked at in the transforms, 2D transforms. Another property is backface visibility. It lets you choose if an element that is being transformed is visible when its back faces the viewer. So if you have this, for example, sorry, if you rotate it in a way that you can see its back, if the back face visibility is a default value which is visible, you can still see it. Sorry about that. So the default value, like I said, is visible, and we can now look at an example of a 3D transform. In this case, we're going to rotate a photo 25 degrees using a transform. So first we set the perspective to a value something other than 0 on the parent element. Then we position the viewer and we position the image in the center of the page in this case. And then we add the hover status to the photo and we add the transform to it. If an element has children inside it, the children are by default transformed flat with the parents. So it's like as if the children were just drawn on a flat piece of paper. So if you move the paper, the children are flat. To bring the children up and above that plane, we can apply the property transform style preserve 3D. So then we can stack the children in different planes. We can bring it above the parent. For example, if we apply the preserve 3D property to this parent container, now we can position the children in different levels. In this case, one 50 pixels above the parent and the second 40 pixels. But for transforms to look nice and smooth, we need something else. They don't just look nice and smooth by themselves. And what we need is transitions. Because if we have no transitions between the states, the transitions will be quite harsh and it's not going to be very pleasing. So the transitions will make it smooth. If we go back to the first example of that flower that was moving 600 pixels to the right, this is what I showed you. But the transition part is actually missing from here. The entire code looks like this. Note that the transition information is added to the element that we are going to apply the transition to, not to the state in which is being transitioned. So in this case, not to the hover state. So first we set the property to be transitioned, then we set the duration of the transition, then we define when the transition should start, and then we defined the speed at which it will go. So you can have a constant speed throughout, or it can be slower in the beginning, or it can be faster in the beginning, and so on. In this case, it starts slow, so we've used the keyword ease in. You can also put everything in the shorthand version, which is much simpler. And also, as an alternative, instead of specifying exactly which property is being transitioned, you can just use the keyword all and everything will be transitioned. So finally, the animations. And this is where things start to get really fun. But of course, the W3C definition is not very fun. It says that CSS animations allow an author to modify CSS property values over time. It's actually quite simple to understand, but it doesn't say much. So what you can do is you can create specific animations that you will then reuse later in the CSS. So here, first we name the animation. In this case, we are going to animate the background of a box, so we'll call it sky. And second, we define which properties will be animated and how and at which points in time. Then we can call the animation that we've just created. We specify its duration, we specify how it will progress over time, and how many times it should be repeated. And we also can specify if the animation should play in reverse on alternate cycles. So in this case, if an animation starts here in the beginning, you can say that it either goes right to the end and then jumps back to the beginning and then to the end and then jumps, or you can go from the beginning to the end and then in reverse like this. And that's what we're doing here. It alternates. And again, we can put everything in a single property. And with this, we have our animation with the background changing color. If we want to make these flowers spin, we just need to create a separate keyframe animation to rotate them and apply it to all of them. So to make these work, the CSS needs to be a little bit longer than I've been showing you. Because these are not standardized yet, we need to use vendor prefixes. Depending on which browsers support a property, we will need to add more or fewer vendor properties. So if we go back to the first example, this is what I showed for the transform, but this is what it actually looks like if we want the animation to work cross-browser. So there are several good resources online where you can check which properties are supported by which browser, and I would find it safer to include the vendor-specific property even if newer versions of the browser are released that don't need it anymore, at least for a little while. And I can recommend two resources. The Wikipedia entry titled "Comparison of Layout Engines" is really, really useful. I have this page open all the time when I'm doing CSS because it's a really good resource. It's constantly being updated, and it has links to all the bugs if you need to check anything. It's really good. And the website When Can I Use? It shows you which properties are supported in which browser versions, which need a prefix and which don't. To make this even more easy, we can use dynamic CSS. So we can use, for example, less or sass. Less and sass are preprocessors, so they use syntax that looks like CSS but that expands on it. So you work on a file that accepts these kind of extensions to the syntax, and the compiler then has the job of translating it to normal CSS that a browser will understand and render properly. One of the things that you can use when you're using preprocessors is mixins. And the mixin is basically a class that can be reused later. So you specify the properties, and then you can just use that class in a selector further down within the CSS itself. You can also create a mixin where the properties are not initially defined, and that's where it becomes useful for what we're looking at today. So we can list all the vendor prefixes we need, and instead of assigning a specific value to translate X, in this case, we can use what, for example, less calls variables. The variable called value X is defined only when the mixin is used further down the code. You don't have to specify it when you create the mixin. Also, instead of just one, we can have several variables. And then we can use the mixin further down the code, and we just need to replace the variable names by the actual values we want the animation to have, or the transition to have. So this is supposed to be a short talk. We don't really have much time to go to do an in-depth view of this dynamic CSS, but it's quite an interesting subject, and it's quite easy to understand how it can be helpful, and I see more and more people trying it out. So if you're interested, there's an excellent book that I can recommend that goes into this subject in really great detail. And speaking of resources, there are really good resources out there about CSS transforms, about transitions, about animations. I can recommend CSS3 for Web Designers, if you haven't read it yet. Is a really good, quick intro to the subject. Really good, by Dan Cederholm. And if you're looking for something more in-depth, more with step-by-step guides with lots of examples, you can look at Andy Clark's Hard-Boiled Web Design. And in terms of online resources, there's, of course, WebKit's blog, Surf in Safari, and Mozilla Developer Network. These are really good, solid starting points. And the actual spec, which is for these subjects, it is surprisingly brief. I always recommend that CSS authors read the spec, at least of the parts they're interested in at a particular time, the parts that you're working on at the moment, or the parts you're experimenting with at the time. I know it's not the most exciting document on the internet, but it can make you understand why things happen the way they do in the browser, and it's an opportunity to know what is planned, and it's an opportunity to know how it can contribute. And there are several calls to action in these documents, especially in specifications that are really new, like this one. There's a lot of little comments saying we don't really know what to do here, we need more examples, we need use cases, or maybe we're going to drop this if we don't have more examples, and things like that. So you should check it out. So these new CSS features are great. I mean, they make creating animations really, really easy for us CSS authors. We don't usually know a lot of JavaScript, and we would need to spend quite a long time looking for plugins online. So it saves us time. But there are some things that I think we should take into consideration if we're going to use them. First, of course, boring browser support. It isn't completely widespread, although it is getting better. Since I've made this talk initially, I've been updating this table constantly. So it's pretty good. I've included I10 here, even though it hasn't been released yet. But this still makes animations and transitions and things like that. It still puts them in the accessory basket. So they can't really be used for anything that is essential, that is crucial for the functionality of the site. Another thing we should take into consideration is that we need to be careful not to go back 15 years ago. We should we should use them carefully. I mean, now we see every element on our site is jumping up and down when you hover over it, and like every hover state takes 5 seconds to be fully displayed, and it's kind of like going back to when we had rotating skulls in our backgrounds. Finally, some people say that CSS is getting too much into JavaScript's arena. I actually haven't made my mind up about this one. I see the value of the argument, at least in some cases. Because we always said that a site is structured in 3 layers. We have the content with the markup, we have the style with the CSS, and we have the behavior with our JavaScript. And when we begin mixing behavior with the behavior layer with the style layer, we are in a way going against our own rules. And especially with very complex animations. So I agree that these are a lot easier to accomplish with CSS, but in some instances we can ask whether it's the wrong tool for the job. So I think maybe this is something that we can discuss later. I'm sure you'll have your opinions, and I'd like to hear about that. So, what are the characteristics of a well thought out animation? I mean, I'm not talking about experiments, because if you're testing the limits of a technology, you should be doing crazy experiments. You should be making movies. You should be making opening sequences of films. You should be playful. You should be having fun. But when you're trying to reach as many people as possible, when accessibility and when usability are important considerations, I think you should be a little bit more restrained. A good example of an animation will delight. People will smile. There is a sense of satisfaction, and it's an elegant solution. And it's beautiful, but it's still an accessory to the important content. It doesn't get in the way. It doesn't disturb. And if you remove the transition or the animation, you can still access the content. But if you use animations well, when you remove them, there is this sense of pleasure. There is kind of this warm, fuzzy feeling that is lost, and I think that's when it means that the animations were there for a purpose. These animations are really easy to implement. They're everywhere now. I mean, every link on every navigation menu on every site will have this ease-in effect when you hover over the links, and every thumbnail will have a little transform when you hover over it. And it's just because you can. It's just because it's easy. There's really no thought put into this. It makes the animations that are really important less important, because I mean, if everything in your website shouts, then nothing will shout. And as designers, we like to think that we distinguish ourselves from the amateur because we are aware of the theory behind what we do. We study typography, and we study the theory of color, and we study layout and proportions, and we like to apply this really carefully created scales and really nicely done grids. So we're very professional about these things. But when it comes to adding animation to our site, we don't really think about the principles behind motion, and we don't think about storyboards. We don't really study animation techniques. We don't get inspired by them. For example, the 12 basic principles of animation, which were published by Ollie Johnson and Frank Thomas, who were 2 Disney animators in their book, The Illusion of Life. And these theories are still applied today. I mean, they're behind every modern Western animation, and are just one example of a great resource that we should learn from. And even though we're not producing feature films, we can still learn from these principles. At the moment, the audio is not working. We're still discovering how to use these tools and techniques, but we're not really thinking about when and why to use them. But we should, because we can do really great things with these fantastic tools. That's it. It's okay. It's okay. That's it. Any questions?